Again, I want to thank our witnesses for being here today and for bearing with us through our line of questioning and sharing from your experience and your expertise in this area. And I would agree with the ranking member to a greater extent if this was 100 years ago. But now today, I would suggest that unions have greatly, largely, for the most part, outlived their usefulness to right the wrongs that existed, the injustices that existed in the early history of our country. We have so many laws in place now to protect workers, and of course we have just competitive practices and best practices, I should say, that just make the fact that unions have long outlived their usefulness, in my opinion and my experience. I grew up in a lower income family, having to work all of my life, going back to my preteen years, eventually trying to work my way through college, thankfully successfully with a partial athletic scholarship, working to pay off my student loans. Imagine that, by the way. I worked for many small businesses along the way, little sole proprietorships, carpenters, landscapers, painters, those sorts of things, and then more established small businesses, including lumber yards, construction companies. I didn't ever do a restaurant, Mr. DeSaulnier, and I'm sure that your company culture was excellent, as Mr. Leedy's was. I got hired once to work at a restaurant, but I had a landscaping injury that on the day that I was supposed to report, because I was working that morning on my way to a restaurant, so I never did actually make it there. But the highest paying job I ever had in my working years before finishing college, those summers and those working my way through school, was a union job. It was at an auto factory down in the Hampton Roads area of Virginia, Virginia Beach, Norfolk, Chesapeake area. It was the highest paying job that I ever had prior to graduating college until the plant closed. And it was also the most dysfunctional workplace that I ever experienced, was that union shop. And just because of the work ethic that I had as a young college kid and what I brought to the workplace, they quickly put me in charge of several of the more permanent union employees who I worked with. But the division, there's a lot of problems that come from a union culture, a union situation. Division in the workplace, a resentment in the workplace between employees and management, suspicion in the workplace, in other words, that the management and the ownership doesn't have the best interest of employees. Just an unhealthy workplace, as what I've experienced and what I've learned from others who've worked in such situations. Reduced productivity, reduced efficiency, protection of poor workers, underperforming workers. I can remember my experience again in that auto shop, many employees saying, I get no more if I work harder, or I work less, if I do more, if I do less. There's no incentive. Slow down, college boy. It doesn't make any difference how hard you work or how much you do. We're all going to get the same thing. We all take our breaks at the same time. We don't have to work, any more or any less from a incentive standpoint. It stifles ambition. It stifles ascension through the ranks. In a healthy workplace, I'm going to guess, Mr. Lee, this was your experience, that your employees they might want to be foreman. They might want to be shift supervisor. They might want to be superintendent. And they looked at that positively and they aspired to that, some of them, and then some did not. That's not what they didn't want the extra responsibility or time or whatever was required of that. But there wasn't a negative us against them mentality that once you got into management, you've crossed over, you've become the enemy, you've become the opposition. That so often is the case. That's in a union shop. Unions increase costs unnecessarily on businesses. They reduce competitiveness. They certainly reduce American competitiveness. And too often, like my experience working for an auto factory, they result in the business closing or at least diminished expansion incentive. The government, and specifically the NLRB, should not be tipping the scales in favor of unions against employers, ultimately against employees and customers for that matter, and against America, I would say, on the global stage. Democrats' union fetish is consistent with their obsession more broadly with stripping independence from businesses, seizing more control from businesses, and frankly, eliminating choice for Americans, including in the workplace. Of course, it could be, as the gentleman from Indiana talked about a few moments ago, as well as the gentleman from Missouri, it could be because of the hundreds of millions of campaign dollars that flow into Democrat coffers from unions, or the millions that are contributed to left-wing causes, quite frankly, without the permission of those workers whose wages are confiscated to go towards union dues, and they have no say how those dues are applied or how those are utilized. That's why for my friends on the other side, their ultimate dream is the PRO Act. The PRO Act, thankfully, which did not get through the last Congress. But the PRO Act would give employers essentially two choices. Embrace a union, help the organization within your workplace, or just close your doors, which would be the only remaining protest or form of resistance if that was to become law, the PRO Act. We talked about polls this morning. Some of our members mentioned polls. The true poll, or the most accurate poll when it comes to unions in this country today, is only 10% of American workers choose to work in a union shop. And only 6% of small business employees who are under the jurisdiction of the NLRB have actually voted to be represented by a union. So thankfully, those are at all-time historic lows. That's why it is so important that we fight against the Biden administration's NLRB's crusading against employee choice at the behest of big labor, that we resist the Biden administration's efforts to steadily chip away at longstanding workplace rights, that we protect workers' right to choose whether to join a union, and we ensure that employers retain the right to speak freely the truth about unions.